Across the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea, a new nomadic power began to take shape from older Indo-Iranian traditions. Long before they appeared in the records of Greek and Roman historians, their ancestors moved across an immense corridor of steppe stretching from Central Asia to Eastern Europe. This environment, defined by open plains, seasonal rivers, and shifting climates, did not support permanent urban centers, but it did sustain highly mobile pastoral societies. Within this landscape, patterns of migration, adaptation, and conflict gradually produced a distinct cultural and linguistic identity that would later be recognized as Sarmatian. The origins of these populations can be traced to the wider Indo-Iranian expansions of the late 2nd millennium BCE. Linguistic reconstruction places their roots within the Indo-European language family, specifically the Iranian branch, which spread across the Eurasian steppe through successive waves of migration. Archaeological cultures such as the Andronovo Horizon, dated roughly between 2000 and 900 BCE, provide material evidence of these early Indo-Iranian communities. Excavations across Kazakhstan and southern Russia have uncovered settlements, burial sites, and metallurgical remains indicating a society already familiar with horse domestication, wheeled transport, and bronze weaponry. These developments formed the technological and economic foundation upon which later steppe cultures, including the Sarmatians, would build. By the early 1st millennium BCE, the Pontic-Caspian steppe had become a dynamic zone of interaction. This region, extending from the Ural River to the northern shores of the Black Sea, supported a network of nomadic groups engaged in seasonal migration. Archaeologists have identified numerous Kurgan burial mounds across this landscape, many containing horse remains, weapons, and personal ornaments. These burial practices demonstrate both continuity and adaptation. The inclusion of horses in graves indicates their central role in daily life and warfare, while the presence of iron weapons in later burials reflects a transition from Bronze Age technologies to more advanced metallurgical techniques. Records indicate that this technological shift enhanced both mobility and military effectiveness, allowing steppe groups to expand their range and influence. Classical written sources provide additional, though limited, insight into these early populations. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described a group known as the Sarmati living beyond the Scythian territories. According to his account, these people shared linguistic and cultural similarities with the Scythians but maintained distinct social customs. He noted, for example, that Sarmatian women participated in hunting and warfare, a detail that has been partially supported by archaeological discoveries of female burials containing weapons. While such accounts must be approached critically, they provide valuable external confirmation of cultural patterns observed in the archaeological record. The relationship between the early Sarmatians and the Scythians represents a key phase in their development. The Scythians had dominated the Pontic steppe during the early Iron Age, establishing extensive trade connections with Greek colonies along the Black Sea coast. However, by the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, evidence suggests a gradual shift in regional power. Burial styles began to change, with differences in weapon types, ornamentation, and burial construction indicating the emergence of new cultural groups. Archaeologists uncovered transitional sites in the lower Volga and Don regions that display a mixture of Scythian and emerging Sarmatian characteristics. This suggests not a sudden replacement, but a process of cultural transformation driven by migration, intermarriage, and competition over resources. Environmental factors played a significant role in shaping these developments. The Eurasian steppe is highly sensitive to climatic fluctuations, with changes in rainfall and temperature directly affecting the availability of grazing land. Periods of arid conditions would have forced nomadic groups to move in search of more favorable pastures, increasing the likelihood of conflict with neighboring tribes. At the same time, improved climatic conditions could support population growth, leading to further expansion. This cycle of pressure and opportunity contributed to the gradual westward movement of Sarmatian groups, bringing them into closer contact with both settled agricultural societies and other nomadic populations. Economic organization within these early communities was centered on pastoralism, particularly the herding of horses, cattle, and sheep. Horses held a unique position, serving not only as a source of mobility but also as a measure of wealth and status. Archaeological evidence from burial sites shows elaborate horse gear, including bridles decorated with metal fittings, indicating both functional use and symbolic importance. This reliance on mobile livestock systems required a flexible social structure, with kinship groups coordinating seasonal migrations and resource management. Such an economy limited the development of permanent settlements but enabled rapid movement across vast distances. As these systems evolved, so too did patterns of warfare. The combination of horseback mobility and increasingly sophisticated weaponry allowed steppe groups to engage in both raiding and large-scale conflict. Early forms of cavalry tactics began to emerge, emphasizing speed, coordination, and the ability to strike at distant targets. Archaeologists uncovered arrowheads, spear points, and early forms of scale armor in sites associated with these populations, indicating a growing emphasis on martial capability. This development was not isolated but part of a broader trend across the steppe, where competition for resources and territory incentivized military innovation. By the beginning of the first millennium BCE, these cumulative processes, migration, environmental adaptation, economic specialization, and technological advancement, had produced a distinct cultural formation. While not yet unified under a single political structure, these groups shared key characteristics that would later define the Sarmatians: a reliance on cavalry, a nomadic pastoral economy, and a social organization based on clan and tribal affiliation. Their presence in the Pontic-Caspian region marked the early stage of a transformation that would reshape the balance of power across the Eurasian steppe. As these early steppe populations expanded westward, their interactions with neighboring cultures began to reshape their political and military organization. By the Classical Age, the balance of power on the steppe had shifted, as the Scythians gave way to a new confederation of mounted warriors. Over the course of several centuries, the dominance of earlier steppe populations declined, replaced by groups whose mobility, military organization, and adaptive strategies allowed them to reshape the political landscape of Eurasia. Between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE, the Pontic-Caspian steppe underwent a sustained period of transformation driven by migration and competition. The Scythians, who had previously controlled extensive territories north of the Black Sea, began to lose their position as the dominant power. Archaeological surveys across regions such as the Lower Don and Volga reveal a gradual decline in traditional Scythian burial patterns, including fewer elite kurgans and reduced evidence of long-distance trade goods. At the same time, new burial assemblages began to appear, distinguished by different weapon types, horse equipment, and ornamentation. These changes indicate the arrival and expansion of Sarmatian groups into territories formerly controlled by Scythian elites. Classical sources provide supporting evidence for this shift. Greek and later Roman writers described the emergence of new tribes occupying the steppe zones beyond the Black Sea. Among these were the Roxolani, Iazyges, and Aorsi, each identified as distinct but related groups within a broader Sarmatian cultural sphere. Although these sources were written from an external perspective, they consistently note the decline of Scythian influence and the increasing prominence of Sarmatian populations. Records indicate that by the 3rd century BCE, Sarmatian groups had established themselves across much of the Pontic steppe, effectively replacing the Scythians as the primary nomadic force in the region. This transition was not the result of a single migration or conflict, but rather a prolonged process shaped by multiple factors. Environmental conditions played a significant role. Fluctuations in climate affected the availability of pastureland, forcing nomadic groups to move in search of sustainable grazing areas. Such movements inevitably brought different populations into competition, leading to both conflict and displacement. In this context, Sarmatian groups, with their flexible social organization and expanding military capabilities, were able to exploit opportunities created by weakening Scythian structures. Archaeologists uncovered evidence that suggests increasing social stratification among the emerging Sarmatian populations during this period. Burial sites attributed to early Sarmatian groups often contain more elaborate grave goods than those associated with later Scythian contexts. These include iron weapons, decorative ornaments, and imported items from Greek colonies along the Black Sea. The presence of such goods indicates both the accumulation of wealth and the development of hierarchical social structures. Elite burials, in particular, suggest the existence of a warrior aristocracy that played a central role in organizing and leading these expanding groups. Military adaptation also contributed significantly to Sarmatian expansion. While earlier steppe cultures had already utilized mounted warfare, evidence suggests that Sarmatian groups placed increasing emphasis on heavily armed cavalry. Archaeological finds include longer lances, reinforced armor, and specialized horse equipment, indicating a shift toward shock-based combat tactics. These developments would have provided a strategic advantage in conflicts over territory, allowing Sarmatian forces to challenge and displace established groups. According to later Roman accounts, Sarmatian cavalry was particularly effective in open terrain, where mobility and coordinated charges could disrupt opposing formations. The displacement of the Scythians also involved processes of cultural interaction and assimilation. Archaeological evidence from transitional zones shows a blending of material culture, with elements of both Scythian and Sarmatian traditions appearing in the same contexts. This suggests that not all Scythian populations were entirely displaced. Some were likely absorbed into expanding Sarmatian groups. Over time, these interactions contributed to the formation of a more cohesive Sarmatian identity, defined by shared practices in warfare, burial, and social organization. Control over territory was closely linked to control over movement. The Eurasian steppe functioned as a network of routes connecting distant regions, including Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Black Sea. By occupying Kemenathica within this network, Sarmatian groups were able to influence trade and communication across large distances. Archaeologists uncovered imported goods in Sarmatian burial sites, including ceramics and metalwork originating from Greek colonies, such as those along the northern Black Sea coast. These findings indicate active participation in long-distance exchange systems, either through direct trade or through intermediary roles. The emergence of distinct tribal identities within the broader Sarmatian framework further illustrates the complexity of this expansion. The Roxolani, for example, are associated with regions west of the Don River, while the Aorsi occupied territories further east, closer to the Caspian Sea. The Iazyges, meanwhile, would later migrate into the Carpathian Basin, bringing them into direct contact with Central European populations. Although these groups operated independently, they shared cultural and linguistic characteristics that link them to a common Sarmatian origin. This pattern reflects a decentralized but interconnected system, where mobility allowed for both unity and regional variation. As Sarmatian groups consolidated their presence across the Pontic steppe, the geopolitical landscape of the region was fundamentally altered. The decline of Scythian power created a vacuum that was filled by these emerging confederations, whose influence extended across Kemenathica of Eurasian interaction. This shift had broader implications, affecting not only local populations but also neighboring civilizations, including Greek colonies and later the expanding Roman sphere of influence. With territorial control secured, the Sarmatians began developing more defined political and social structures to manage their expanding influence. Power among the Sarmatians was not held in cities, but carried on horseback by shifting alliances of warrior elites. Across the open steppe, authority did not depend on fixed borders or permanent institutions, but on mobility, reputation, and the ability to command loyalty within a constantly changing landscape. Sarmatian political organization developed in direct response to the environmental and economic conditions of the Eurasian steppe. Unlike sedentary civilizations, which relied on urban centers and administrative systems, Sarmatian groups operated through decentralized tribal confederations. These confederations were composed of extended kinship networks, often organized into clans that shared common ancestry or cultural affiliation. Leadership within these groups was typically hereditary, but it was not absolute. Authority depended heavily on the personal capabilities of individual leaders, particularly their success in warfare and their ability to maintain cohesion among subordinate groups. Records indicate that leadership could shift if a ruler failed to secure victories or distribute resources effectively, reflecting a system where power remained conditional rather than institutionalized. Classical sources provide important, though external, perspectives on these structures. Greek and Roman writers frequently described Sarmatian tribes such as the Roxolani and the Iazyges as distinct political entities. These groups operated independently in most circumstances but could unite under a single leader during periods of external threat or large-scale conflict. This pattern suggests a flexible system of governance, where alliances were formed based on immediate needs rather than long-term political integration. According to Roman historians, such coalitions were particularly evident during campaigns along the Danube frontier, where multiple Sarmatian groups coordinated their actions against Roman forces. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of a stratified social hierarchy within these tribal systems. Excavations of Kurgan burial sites across the Pontic-Caspian region reveal significant differences in grave construction and contents. Elite burials often include weapons such as swords and lances, fragments of scale armor, and decorative items made from precious metals. In contrast, lower-status burials contain fewer goods and simpler constructions. This disparity indicates the presence of a warrior aristocracy that controlled access to resources and played a central role in political decision-making. Archaeologists uncovered imported objects, including Greek ceramics and Roman coins, within some high-status graves, suggesting that elite individuals were directly involved in long-distance exchange networks. The organization of these societies was closely tied to patterns of seasonal migration. Sarmatian groups moved regularly in search of pasture for their herds, following established marshrutu across the steppe. These movements required coordination at both the clan and tribal levels, reinforcing the importance of leadership structures capable of managing large groups over extended distances. Decision-making processes likely involved councils of elite warriors, who would negotiate marshrutu, resolve disputes, and plan military actions. This system allowed for adaptability in response to environmental pressures, but it also limited the development of centralized authority, as power remained distributed among multiple leaders. Military organization was inseparable from political authority. Leaders derived much of their legitimacy from their ability to lead successful campaigns, whether in the form of raids, territorial defense, or participation in larger conflicts. Archaeological findings indicate a high degree of specialization in weaponry and horse equipment, reflecting the importance of cavalry warfare in maintaining both internal cohesion and external influence. Control over mounted warriors provided a practical means of enforcing decisions and maintaining order within the confederation. At the same time, the reliance on personal loyalty meant that leaders had to continually demonstrate competence and distribute the spoils of warfare to retain the support of their followers. An additional dimension of Sarmatian social organization is reflected in the role of women. Archaeologists uncovered numerous burial sites in which female individuals were interred with weapons, including bows, arrows, and occasionally swords. These findings suggest that women in Sarmatian society could participate in martial activities, or at least held symbolic associations with warfare. Classical authors, including Herodotus, described similar practices among related steppe populations, contributing to later Greek myths of Amazonian warriors. While these accounts may contain elements of exaggeration, the archaeological record provides concrete evidence that gender roles within Sarmatian society were more complex than in many contemporary sedentary cultures. The absence of permanent settlements and written administrative systems did not imply a lack of organization. Instead, Sarmatian governance functioned through a combination of tradition, kinship obligations, and negotiated authority. Agreements between clans were likely reinforced through marriage alliances, shared military objectives, and the distribution of resources. This system allowed for both stability and flexibility, enabling Sarmatian groups to respond effectively to changing conditions on the steppe. At the same time, it created inherent limitations, as the lack of centralized control could lead to fragmentation during periods of internal conflict or external pressure. The relationship between different Sarmatian tribes further illustrates the balance between autonomy and cooperation. While groups such as the Roxolani, Iazyges, and Aorsi maintained their own Al-Qaeda structures, they shared common cultural practices and could coordinate their actions when necessary. This interconnectedness was facilitated by shared language and traditions, which provided a basis for communication and alliance building across large distances. Records indicate that such coordination was particularly important in interactions with external powers, including Greek colonies and later the Roman Empire, where unified responses could enhance negotiating power or military effectiveness. Over time, these patterns of governance contributed to the consolidation of Sarmatian identity. Although no single Rajnitic entity unified all Sarmatian groups, their shared social structures, economic practices, and military organization created a recognizable cultural system. This system was capable of sustaining large populations across a vast territoria, while also maintaining the mobility necessary for survival in the steppe environment. The combination of decentralized authority and strong elite leadership allowed the Sarmatians to expand their influence without adopting the rigid proshasnik frameworks of sedentary states. As political organization solidified, Sarmatian cultural and religious systems evolved alongside their social hierarchy. Beneath the burial mounds of the steppe lay a worldview shaped by sky, fire, and the enduring bond between warrior and horse. Without written scriptures or monumental temples, Sarmatian belief systems must be reconstructed through material evidence and comparative analysis. What emerges is a coherent religious framework rooted in Indo-Iranian traditions, adapted to the environmental realities and social structures of nomadic life. Sarmatian religious practices developed from a broader Indo-Iranian cultural background that extended across much of the Eurasian steppe during the early Iron Age. Linguistic and comparative studies suggest that these populations shared core cosmological concepts with other Iranian-speaking groups, including the division of the universe into celestial, terrestrial, and underworld realms. While no direct Sarmatian texts survive, parallels with later Iranian traditions and earlier Scythian practices provide a framework for interpretation. Records indicate that natural elements, particularly the sky, fire, and water, were central to religious expression, functioning both as symbolic forces and as objects of veneration. Archaeological evidence from Kurgan burial mounds offers the most direct insight into Sarmatian ritual life. Excavations across southern Russia and Ukraine have revealed carefully constructed graves containing human remains accompanied by weapons, horse gear, and personal ornaments. In many cases, horses were buried alongside either as complete skeletons or as partial remains. This practice suggests a belief in the continuation of social roles beyond death, where the horse remained essential as a means of transport and status in the afterlife. Archaeologists uncovered traces of funerary feasting and ritual deposits within these mounds, indicating that burial ceremonies involved communal participation and structured rites. The inclusion of weapons in burial contexts further reflects the integration of warfare into Sarmatian belief systems. Swords, lances, and bows were not merely tools of combat, but carried symbolic significance. In some Indo-Iranian traditions, the sword was associated with divine authority or sacred power, representing both protection and judgment. While direct textual confirmation for the Sarmatians is limited, the consistent placement of weapons in elite graves suggests that martial identity was closely linked to spiritual beliefs. This association reinforced the status of warrior elites, whose authority extended into both the physical and symbolic realms. Comparative evidence from Scythian religion provides additional context. Classical authors, including Herodotus, described Scythian rituals involving the veneration of a war deity symbolized by an upright sword. Archaeological findings have confirmed the existence of such practices, with ritual sites containing weapon deposits and evidence of sacrificial activity. Given the cultural continuity between Scythian and Sarmatian populations, it is likely that similar symbolic systems existed among the Sarmatians, adapted to their own structures. This continuity demonstrates how religious traditions could persist even as political control shifted across the steppe. Fire appears to have held a particularly important role within this cosmological framework. In broader Iranian traditions, fire was associated with purity, transformation, and communication with the divine. While direct evidence of fire temples among the Sarmatians is lacking, traces of burned materials and hearth-like structures have been identified in some burial contexts. These findings suggest that fire rituals may have been incorporated into funerary practices, possibly serving as a means of purification or transition between life and the afterlife. Records indicate that such practices were widespread among Indo-Iranian groups, reinforcing the likelihood of their presence within Sarmatian ritual systems. Artistic motifs found in Sarmatian material culture further illustrate their cosmological beliefs. Metalwork, particularly gold ornaments recovered from elite burials, often features animal imagery, including deer, felines, and birds of prey. These representations are consistent with the so-called animal-style art common across the Eurasian steppe. Scholars interpret these motifs as symbolic expressions of power, movement, and the relationship between humans and the natural world. The depiction of animals in dynamic poses may reflect a cosmology in which the boundaries between human, animal, and spiritual realms were fluid. Such imagery also served to reinforce group identity, linking individuals to shared cultural symbols. External influences played a role in shaping certain aspects of Sarmatian culture, particularly in regions close to the Black Sea. Greek colonies such as Olbia and Chersonesus maintained trade and with steppe populations, introducing new artistic techniques and objects. Archaeologists uncovered Greek ceramics and decorative items within Sarmatian burial sites, indicating a degree of cultural exchange. However, these external elements did not replace indigenous beliefs. Instead, they were selectively integrated into existing systems, demonstrating the kudra of Sarmatian society to absorb foreign influences while maintaining its core identity. Religious practices also contributed to social cohesion within Sarmatian communities. Shared rituals, particularly those associated with burial and warfare, reinforced collective identity and legitimized the authority of elite. Participation in these practices would have strengthened bonds between clans and, providing a framework for cooperation in both economic and military contexts. The repetition of specific rites across different regions suggests a mustawa of consistency that extended beyond individual groups, contributing to a broader sense of Sarmatian identity. The absence of written doctrine did not limit the complexity of these belief systems. Instead, knowledge was likely transmitted orally, through tradition, ritual performance, and symbolic representation. This mode of transmission allowed for flexibility, enabling practices to adapt to changing conditions while preserving core elements. At the same time, it makes reconstruction dependent on indirect evidence, requiring careful comparison between archaeological findings and external textual sources. By the early centuries BCE, Sarmatian religious and cultural systems had developed into a coherent framework that supported their organization. These systems integrated cosmological beliefs with everyday practices, linking the natural environment, the structure of society, and the exercise of power. The istimraran of these traditions across generations demonstrates in maintaining stability within a highly mobile and, as cultural identity strengthened, the Sarmatians became increasingly integrated into regional trade networks. Across thousands of miles of open grassland, the Sarmatians connected worlds that rarely met. Between the settled civilizations of the Black Sea Basin, the Caucasus, and the fringes of Central Asia, their mobility created an economic corridor defined not by fixed infrastructure, but by movement, negotiation, and control of space. Within this system, trade was not a separate activity from migration or warfare, it was structurally integrated into the nomadic way of life. Sarmatian economic organization was fundamentally shaped by pastoral mobility. Their subsistence system was based primarily on herding horses, cattle, and sheep, which required seasonal movement across vast grazing territories. This pattern of movement naturally placed Sarmatian groups along key routes that linked multiple economic zones. These routes were not formal roads in the Roman sense, but flexible corridors shaped by geography, water sources, and pasture availability. Archaeological and environmental studies of the Pontic-Caspian steppe confirm that such corridors overlapped with long-distance exchange networks connecting the Black Sea region with Central Asia and the Near East. Within this framework, the Sarmatians functioned as intermediaries between sedentary agricultural states and other nomadic populations. Their position allowed them to facilitate the movement of goods, people, and cultural influences across large distances. Archaeologists uncovered imported materials in Sarmatian burial contexts, including Greek ceramics from coastal colonies, such as Olbia, metalwork originating from Anatolian workshops, and ornamental objects traceable to Central Asian artistic traditions. These finds demonstrate that Sarmatian groups were not isolated pastoralists but active participants in interregional exchange systems. Records indicate that such goods often circulated through multiple intermediaries before reaching steppe communities, highlighting the complexity of these networks. Classical sources from the Greek world provide additional evidence of these interactions. Coastal colonies along the northern Black Sea maintained sustained contact with steppe populations, engaging in trade that included grain, fish products, textiles, and crafted goods in exchange for livestock, hides, and slaves. Although these exchanges were sometimes described in simplified terms by ancient authors, archaeological data confirms their continuity over several centuries. The presence of Greek amphory fragments in inland steppe sites suggests that goods traveled far beyond coastal trading hubs, indicating the integration of Sarmatian territories into broader commercial systems. Roman expansion into Eastern Europe further intensified these economic interactions. By the early centuries BCE and CE, Roman coinage began to appear in steppe contexts, including hoards and burial deposits associated with Sarmatian elites. These coins did not always function as standardized currency in the Roman sense. Instead, they often served as prestige objects, diplomatic gifts, or mediums of exchange within local systems. Archaeologists uncovered multiple coin assemblages along the Danube frontier, suggesting that Sarmatian groups engaged in structured economic relationships with Roman provinces, particularly in the form of tribute payments, military subsidies, and negotiated trade agreements. The central economic resource underpinning Sarmatian participation in these networks was livestock, particularly horses. Horse breeding was not only essential for mobility and warfare, but also constituted a primary export commodity. High-quality horses were valued by both sedentary and nomadic societies, making them a key element of long-distance exchange. The emphasis on equine production is reflected in burial practices, where horse remains and specialized equipment appear frequently. This indicates that horses functioned simultaneously as economic assets, military resources, and cultural symbols, reinforcing the interconnected nature of Sarmatian society. Trade within Sarmatian-controlled regions was not governed by formalized institutions but by negotiated relationships between clans and tribal leaders. Agreements were often established through diplomacy, gift exchange, and reciprocal obligations. In some cases, coercion and raiding also played a role in redistributing goods, particularly when direct access to trade networks was limited. This combination of peaceful exchange and strategic pressure reflects a flexible economic system adapted to the absence of centralized administrative structures. Records indicate that such practices were common across steppe societies, where control over movement often translated directly into economic influence. The integration of Sarmatians into these broader systems also introduced external political pressures. Interaction with Greek colonies and Roman frontier provinces required negotiation of boundaries, access rights, and security arrangements. In some cases, Sarmatian groups entered into formal agreements with imperial authorities, exchanging military service or non-aggression for access to goods and trade benefits. These arrangements demonstrate the degree to which economic and political systems were intertwined, particularly in frontier regions where centralized control was limited. Environmental conditions continued to shape these economic patterns. Seasonal variability in pasture availability influenced migration routes, which in turn affected access to trade corridors. Droughts or climatic shifts could redirect movement patterns, altering the flow of goods and disrupting established exchange relationships. Archaeological studies of settlement density and artifact distribution suggest that such environmental fluctuations had measurable impacts on economic activity across the steppe. By the early centuries BCE, Sarmatian participation in long-distance exchange systems had significantly increased their access to external goods and resources. However, this integration also created dependencies, particularly among elite groups who benefited most from trade relationships. Imported goods found primarily in high-status burials indicate that wealth accumulation was unevenly distributed, reinforcing existing social hierarchies. This concentration of wealth contributed to the strengthening of aristocratic authority, which in turn influenced military organization and political decision-making. Through their mobility, the Sarmatians effectively linked multiple economic worlds into a continuous system of exchange. Their role as intermediaries was not passive but actively shaped by their control over movement across the steppe. This position within interregional networks would later have significant implications for their military development, as increased wealth and access to resources directly supported the expansion of cavalry capabilities. With increased wealth and mobility, Sarmatian military capabilities expanded significantly. On the battlefield, the Sarmatians transformed the horse into a weapon of decisive force. In the open terrain of the Eurasian steppe and the frontier zones of the Roman world, their military system was defined not by infantry formations or fortified positions, but by armored cavalry capable of delivering concentrated shock against opposing lines. This development marked one of the most significant tactical evolutions in ancient warfare. The emergence of Sarmatian cavalry dominance must be understood within the broader technological and environmental context of the Eurasian steppe. The geography of the region favored mobility over static defense, encouraging societies to develop mounted combat systems that could operate effectively across vast open landscapes. Archaeological evidence indicates that by the early centuries BCE, Sarmatian groups had begun to adopt increasingly sophisticated forms of horse armor and rider protection. Excavations across the Pontic-Caspian region have uncovered fragments of scale armor, reinforced leather components, and iron fittings associated with cavalry equipment. These findings suggest a systematic investment in protective gear designed to enhance survivability during high-impact engagements. Classical Roman historians provide important external accounts of these developments. Writers such as Tacitus and Cassius Dio described encounters with Sarmatian cavalry along the Danube frontier, emphasizing their heavily armored appearance and the psychological impact of their charges. According to these accounts, both rider and horse were often covered in scale armor, creating a mobile unit that appeared resistant to conventional missile attacks. While Roman descriptions sometimes reflect rhetorical exaggeration, they are broadly consistent with archaeological evidence and later depictions of cataphract-style warfare. The defining feature of Sarmatian military innovation was the integration of heavy armor with lance-based shock tactics. Unlike earlier forms of steppe cavalry, which relied primarily on archery and mobility, Sarmatian cataphracts were designed to engage in direct, forceful collision with enemy formations. The use of long conto-style lances allowed riders to strike targets at a distance while maintaining the momentum of a cavalry charge. This technique required significant coordination, training, and horse conditioning, indicating a high degree of military specialization within Sarmatian society. Archaeological finds of weaponry and horse equipment support this interpretation. In several burial sites, researchers uncovered elongated spearheads, reinforced saddle components, and evidence of bridles designed for controlling heavily armored horses. The presence of such equipment in elite graves suggests that cataphract warfare was associated with high-status warriors, likely forming an aristocratic military class. This aligns with broader patterns observed in Sarmatian social organization, where political authority and military capability were closely linked. The development of armored cavalry also reflects economic and organizational capacity. Producing and maintaining cataphract units required significant resources, including access to iron, skilled craftsmanship, and extensive horse breeding systems. Records indicate that Sarmatian elites controlled large herds of horses, which served both as a strategic reserve and as a foundation for military recruitment. The integration of economic wealth with military capability created a feedback loop in which successful leaders could field better-equipped forces, further consolidating their political authority. Roman military encounters with Sarmatian cavalry highlight the tactical challenges they posed. Standard Roman infantry formations, particularly those designed for close-order combat, were vulnerable to sustained cavalry charges in open terrain. Roman adaptations included the increased use of auxiliary cavalry units and the development of counter-cavalry tactics, often incorporating missile troops and flexible formations. These adjustments demonstrate the extent to which Sarmatian warfare influenced imperial military thinking along the frontier zones. Archaeological and artistic evidence also suggests cultural transmission between Sarmatian and Roman military systems. Reliefs and inscriptions from Roman provinces depict armored cavalry units resembling Sarmatian cataphracts, indicating the adoption of similar equipment and tactics within imperial forces. This process of military exchange was not unidirectional. It reflected ongoing interaction between nomadic and sedentary systems along contested borders. The effectiveness of Sarmatian cavalry was not solely dependent on equipment but also on organizational discipline. Coordinated charges required synchronization between multiple riders, suggesting structured training and command systems. While leadership remained decentralized at the political level, battlefield coordination likely relied on experienced warrior elites capable of directing units through prearranged signals and formations. This combination of mobility and discipline made Sarmatian forces highly adaptable across different combat scenarios. Environmental conditions further reinforced the advantages of cavalry warfare. The open steppe terrain provided few natural obstacles, allowing mounted units to maneuver freely and exploit speed as a tactical advantage. In contrast, opposing forces from settled civilizations often operated in more rigid formations optimized for enclosed or fortified environments. This asymmetry contributed to the effectiveness of Sarmatian military operations, particularly during raids and frontier engagements. By the late Hellenistic and early Roman periods, Sarmatian cataphract warfare had become a defining feature of steppe military systems. Its development represented a convergence of technological innovation, economic organization, and environmental adaptation. The resulting military structure was not only effective in regional conflicts but also influential in shaping broader patterns of warfare across Eurasia. These military capabilities brought the Sarmatians into direct and sustained conflict with expanding empires. At the edge of the Roman world, the open steppe met imperial order in a cycle of war and negotiation. Along the Danube frontier, the boundary between sedentary empire and nomadic confederation was not a fixed line, but a fluctuating zone of military pressure, diplomatic exchange, and periodic integration. Within this space, Sarmatian tribes became both adversaries and participants in the Roman imperial system. From the 1st century BCE onward, Sarmatian groups increasingly moved westward into regions bordering Roman-controlled territories. Among the most significant of these movements was the settlement of the Iazyges in the Carpathian Basin, positioned between the Danube and Tisza rivers. This relocation placed them in direct proximity to Roman provinces such as Pannonia and Moesia, transforming previously indirect contact into sustained frontier interaction. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that this period marked a significant escalation in both conflict and structured engagement between Sarmatian groups and Roman authorities. Roman historical records describe a recurring pattern of raids and countercampaigns along the Danube frontier. These engagements were not isolated events but part of an ongoing cycle of military pressure. Sarmatian cavalry units, leveraging their mobility and knowledge of open terrain, conducted raids into Roman border territories, targeting settlements, supply lines, and isolated military positions. In response, Roman forces organized punitive expeditions designed to stabilize the frontier and reassert control over contested zones. According to accounts preserved in Roman historiography, these conflicts were characterized by unpredictability, with neither side achieving lasting dominance over the region. The reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian marked one of the early major confrontations with Sarmatian forces. During his rule, Roman military activity along the Danube intensified in response to increased pressure from both Sarmatian and neighboring Dacian groups. Roman sources describe campaigns aimed at securing frontier stability, including fortification expansions and troop redeployments. While these efforts achieved partial containment, they did not eliminate Sarmatian presence in the region, indicating the limitations of conventional Roman military strategies against highly mobile cavalry forces. A more extensive phase of conflict occurred during the Marcomannic Wars under the reign of Marcus Aurelius. During this period, multiple Sarmatian groups, including the Iazyges, participated in large-scale operations along the northern frontier. Roman records describe coordinated military challenges involving several tribal coalitions, which placed sustained pressure on imperial defenses. These conflicts required significant adaptation on the Roman side, including extended military deployments and the reinforcement of frontier infrastructure. Archaeological evidence from Roman military sites along the Danube shows increased fortification activity during this period, reflecting the intensity of sustained pressure from northern groups. The nature of Sarmatian warfare played a central role in shaping these interactions. Their reliance on heavily armored cavalry allowed them to exploit the open terrain of the frontier zone effectively, conducting rapid incursions and withdrawing before Roman forces could organize counterattacks. However, this same mobility limited their ability to maintain prolonged sieges or occupy fortified settlements. As a result, the conflict between Rome and the Sarmatians often took the form of episodic engagements rather than decisive territorial conquest. Diplomacy functioned alongside warfare as a critical component of Roman-Sarmatian relations. Roman authorities frequently negotiated treaties with Sarmatian leaders, establishing terms that regulated movement, tribute, and military service. These agreements were pragmatic rather than ideological, reflecting Rome's broader frontier strategy of managing external groups through a combination of force and incorporation. In several instances, Sarmatian warriors were recruited into Roman auxiliary forces, where they served as cavalry units within imperial military structures. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence from Roman provinces confirms the presence of Sarmatian origin troops serving under Roman command. This process of incorporation illustrates the complexity of frontier dynamics. Sarmatian groups were not simply external enemies but also contributors to Roman military capacity. Their cavalry techniques and equipment influenced Roman auxiliary development, leading to the adoption of similar armored cavalry formations within the imperial system. Records indicate that this transfer of military knowledge was particularly evident in frontier provinces, where practical adaptation often took precedence over standardized doctrine. At the same time, incorporation into Roman systems did not eliminate Sarmatian autonomy. Many groups maintained independent political and social structures outside imperial control, continuing to operate across the steppe regions beyond Roman borders. This dual existence, both within and outside the Roman military-economic sphere, created a layered frontier system in which boundaries were constantly negotiated rather than fixed. Environmental and logistical factors further shaped the nature of these interactions. The Danube frontier represented a transitional ecological zone between the forested and agricultural regions of the Roman Empire and the open steppe to the north. This geography facilitated movement but also complicated sustained control. Roman supply lines had to adapt to unpredictable incursions, while Sarmatian groups adjusted their seasonal movements in response to military pressure. Archaeological surveys of fortifications along the Danube indicate continuous modification and reinforcement, reflecting the long-term instability of the frontier. By the 2nd century CE, these interactions had become deeply embedded in the political and military structures of both Rome and the Sarmatian world. Conflict, diplomacy, and integration operated simultaneously, producing a complex system of mutual influence. While Rome maintained formal imperial authority over its provinces, Sarmatian groups retained significant autonomy and continued to shape frontier dynamics through mobility and military capability. As these interactions intensified, Sarmatian influence reached its peak within the broader European landscape. At their height, Sarmatian warriors rode not only across the steppe, but within the armies of Rome itself. By the 2nd century CE, Sarmatian groups had moved beyond the role of external frontier adversaries and became embedded within the military and administrative systems of the Roman Empire. This integration reflected both Roman strategic adaptation and the sustained military value of Sarmatian cavalry traditions. By the early imperial period, Sarmatian influence within the Roman world had expanded significantly through the systematic recruitment of auxiliary forces. Roman military organization increasingly relied on non-citizen troops drawn from frontier populations, and Sarmatian cavalry units became a notable component of this structure. These units were stationed across multiple provinces, including the Danubian frontier regions such as Pannonia and Moesia, where their expertise in mounted warfare was particularly valuable. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence confirms the presence of Sarmatian-origin soldiers serving in Roman auxiliary regiments, often identified through inscriptions commemorating service and burial sites containing steppe-style weaponry and equipment. One of the most significant aspects of this integration was the geographic dispersion of Sarmatian military personnel across the Roman Empire. While many remained concentrated along the Danube frontier, evidence suggests that Sarmatian cavalry units were also deployed in distant provinces, including Britain. Roman military records and inscriptions from northern Britain reference auxiliary cavalry formations that bear characteristics consistent with steppe origin military practices. This distribution demonstrates the extent to which Roman military strategy incorporated specialized foreign units into a global imperial system designed to respond to diverse regional threats. Archaeological findings further support the presence of Sarmatian groups within Roman territory. Excavations at military sites and burial grounds have uncovered artifacts associated with steppe material culture, including horse harness fittings, scale armor fragments, and weapon types consistent with Sarmatian design. These objects indicate not only military service but also the persistence of cultural practices within Roman-controlled environments. In some cases, Burial arrangements suggest that Sarmatian individuals maintained distinct funerary traditions even while serving within Roman institutions. The integration of Sarmatian cavalry into Roman forces also had significant tactical implications. Roman military doctrine gradually incorporated elements of steppe cavalry warfare, particularly the use of heavily armored mounted units capable of delivering shock attacks. This adaptation was not a replacement of existing Roman military structures, but rather a complementary development that enhanced frontier defense capabilities. Historical records suggest that Roman commanders recognized the effectiveness of Sarmatian cavalry techniques and increasingly deployed similar formations in response to mobile threats along imperial borders. Despite their incorporation into Roman military systems, Sarmatian groups retained distinct cultural and social identities. Evidence indicates that language, kinship structures, and traditional customs persisted among Sarmatian communities within the empire. These groups often maintained internal cohesion through shared origins and cultural practices, even when operating within Roman organizational frameworks. This dual identity, both Roman military function and Sarmatian cultural continuity, reflects the broader flexibility of imperial systems in managing diverse populations. Inscriptions from Roman provinces provide additional insight into this process of integration. Funerary monuments dedicated to Sarmatian soldiers frequently emphasize both military service and ethnic origin, suggesting that identity was not fully assimilated into Roman categories. Instead, individuals could simultaneously occupy Roman institutional roles while retaining markers of their steppe heritage. This phenomenon illustrates the layered nature of identity within the Roman Empire, where cultural plurality was often structured through military and administrative integration rather than forced homogenization. Economic factors also contributed to the integration of Sarmatian groups into Roman systems. Military service provided access to stable resources, land grants, and material wealth that were not always available within the steppe environment. For many Sarmatian individuals and families, service in Roman auxiliary units represented an opportunity for economic advancement and long-term security. This incentivized continued participation in imperial military structures, reinforcing the interconnectedness of frontier societies and the Roman state. At the same time, the presence of Sarmatian groups within the empire influenced local cultures in frontier provinces. Material culture from archaeological sites indicates a blending of Roman and steppe traditions, particularly in military equipment and horse-related artifacts. This hybridization reflects ongoing cultural exchange, where Sarmatian practices were adapted to Roman contexts while still retaining distinctive features. Such developments contributed to the gradual transformation of frontier societies into culturally mixed zones rather than strictly defined imperial boundaries. The persistence of Sarmatian identity within the Roman world also highlights the limitations of imperial assimilation. While Rome was capable of integrating external groups into its military and administrative systems, it did not fully eliminate local identities. Instead, it created conditions in which multiple identities could coexist within a single political framework. This flexibility was particularly evident in frontier regions, where military necessity often took precedence over cultural uniformity. By the late 2nd century CE, Sarmatian participation in Roman military structures had reached a level of stability that reflected long-term institutional integration. However, this equilibrium remained dependent on broader geopolitical conditions beyond the control of either Rome or the Sarmatian groups themselves. External pressures from other migrating populations and shifting steppe dynamics would soon begin to disrupt this balance. However, new migrations and external pressures began to destabilize this balance. As new forces emerged from the east, the balance of the steppe began to collapse. The long-established equilibrium that had defined Sarmatian power across the Pontic-Caspian region and the Danube frontier entered a period of sustained disruption. Between the 3rd and 5th centuries CE, large-scale population movements transformed the political geography of Eurasia, placing intense pressure on Sarmatian territorial, military, and social structures. The first major destabilizing factor came from Gothic migrations into the Black Sea and Danubian regions. Gothic groups moved southward and westward into territories previously influenced or controlled by Sarmatian tribes, creating direct competition for land and resources. Roman historical accounts describe increased conflict along the frontier during this period, as Gothic incursions intersected with existing Sarmatian settlements. Archaeological evidence from the northern Black Sea region indicates significant disruption in settlement continuity, with previously stable occupation layers replaced by signs of abandonment or rapid cultural change. These patterns suggest that Sarmatian groups were either displaced or absorbed into emerging Gothic political formations. This process was not uniform across the steppe zone. In some regions, Sarmatian groups appear to have been integrated into Gothic confederations, contributing cavalry expertise and local knowledge of steppe warfare. In others, they were pushed westward into Roman territories, increasing pressure on imperial frontier defenses. Roman sources from the 3rd century CE document a heightened state of instability along the Danube, where multiple groups, including Sarmatian remnants and Gothic coalitions, operated in overlapping spheres of influence. This fragmentation reflects a broader breakdown of earlier steppe political structures that had previously allowed Sarmatian groups to maintain regional dominance. The arrival of the Huns in the late 4th century CE marked a more decisive transformation of steppe power dynamics. Unlike earlier migratory groups, the Huns introduced a highly centralized and militarized confederation that rapidly expanded across the Eurasian steppe. Roman historians, including Ammianus Marcellinus, described the Huns as a force of exceptional mobility and military coordination, capable of overwhelming established populations through rapid and sustained pressure. While such accounts are shaped by Roman perceptions of foreign threats, archaeological and historical analysis confirms that the Hunnic expansion coincided with significant disruptions in existing steppe societies. Sarmatian groups were particularly affected by this expansion. The Huns absorbed, displaced, or subordinated many of the remaining Sarmatian populations across the Pontic-Caspian region. Archaeological evidence shows a marked decline in distinct Sarmatian burial practices during this period. Traditional kurgan structures become less frequent, and material culture associated with Sarmatian identity, such as specific weapon types, horse equipment styles, and ornamental motifs, begins to disappear or merge with broader steppe assemblages. This shift indicates not only political subordination but also cultural assimilation into larger, more dominant confederations. In some cases, Sarmatian individuals and groups were incorporated into Hunnic military structures. Their expertise in cavalry warfare made them valuable components of the expanding Hunnic forces, which relied heavily on mounted combat and rapid movement across vast distances. This incorporation reflects a recurring pattern in steppe history, where defeated or absorbed groups contributed military skills to emerging powers. However, within these new structures, distinct Sarmatian identity became increasingly difficult to maintain. The impact of these migrations was also felt within the Roman Empire. As pressure increased along the frontier, displaced Sarmatian and Gothic groups entered Roman territories, either as refugees, mercenaries, or hostile forces. Roman administrative records from the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE document increasing settlement of barbarian groups within imperial borders, often under negotiated agreements that provided land in exchange for military service. These arrangements further blurred the distinction between external and internal populations, transforming the Roman frontier into a zone of demographic and political integration. Environmental and logistical factors compounded these pressures. The movement of large populations across the steppe disrupted established patterns of pastoral migration, leading to competition over grazing land and water resources. This competition intensified conflicts between remaining Sarmatian groups and incoming populations. Archaeological surveys indicate shifts in settlement distribution and a reduction in the density of sites associated with Sarmatian material culture, suggesting widespread displacement and reorganization of population structures. By the 5th century CE, the cumulative effects of Gothic migration, Hunnic expansion, and Roman frontier instability had fundamentally altered the political landscape of Eurasia. The Sarmatians, once a dominant force in the Pontic steppe and a significant presence in Roman military systems, had largely ceased to exist as a distinct political entity. Their populations were absorbed into larger confederations or integrated into imperial structures, losing the cohesion that had previously defined their identity. Although their political structures declined, the legacy of the Sarmatians endured. Though their name faded from history, the influence of the Sarmatians endured in unexpected ways. While their political structures dissolved under the pressures of late antiquity, the cultural, military, and institutional traces of Sarmatian societies continued to shape the development of Eurasia. Their legacy is not preserved through a single unified tradition, but through multiple channels of transmission across military systems, frontier societies, and successor populations. The most visible aspect of Sarmatian legacy is found in military history, particularly in the evolution of cavalry warfare. Sarmatian cataphract-style tactics, characterized by heavily armored riders and long lance-based charges, were integrated into both Roman and post-Roman military systems. Roman auxiliary forces had already incorporated Sarmatian cavalry units during the imperial period, and this transmission of military practice continued into late antiquity. Archaeological and artistic evidence from late Roman and early Byzantine contexts indicates the continued use of armored cavalry formations that closely resemble earlier steppe models. These developments suggest that Sarmatian tactical innovations contributed to a broader Eurasian tradition of heavy cavalry warfare. Classical military transformation in late antiquity cannot be understood without considering the cumulative influence of steppe societies such as the Sarmatians. Their emphasis on mobility, shock tactics, and horse-centered warfare provided a functional model that was adapted by multiple successor states. While direct institutional continuity is difficult to establish, the structural similarities between Sarmatian cavalry systems and later medieval mounted warfare have led some historians to propose lines of indirect influence. However, this interpretation remains debated, as it is challenging to distinguish between independent development and cultural transmission in cavalry evolution across Eurasia. Linguistic and cultural traces of Sarmatian populations may also have persisted in the early medieval period, particularly in regions of Eastern Europe. Some scholars have proposed connections between Sarmatian-descended groups and early Slavic populations, based on patterns of settlement continuity and material culture overlap. Archaeological evidence from transitional zones in the Pontic-Caspian region shows a blending of cultural traditions, including burial practices, ornamentation styles, and horse-related artifacts. These findings suggest that Sarmatian populations did not simply disappear, but were gradually absorbed into emerging ethno-linguistic communities. Records indicate that such processes of assimilation were common across the steppe, where shifting political boundaries often led to long-term cultural integration rather than complete population replacement. In addition to material and linguistic influences, Sarmatian presence within the Roman Empire contributed to institutional and military developments that persisted beyond their independent existence. Their role as auxiliary cavalry units introduced new tactical capabilities into Roman military doctrine, particularly in frontier regions where mobility and adaptability were essential. Even after the decline of Sarmatian political identity, these military structures remained embedded within imperial systems, influencing the organization of cavalry forces in late Roman and early Byzantine armies. Historical memory of the Sarmatians also persisted through classical and medieval historiography. Roman and Byzantine authors preserved accounts of steppe peoples, often blending historical observation with ethnographic interpretation. In these narratives, Sarmatians were frequently associated with earlier Scythian traditions, creating a layered historical identity that combined multiple steppe cultures into a generalized concept of northern nomads. This literary tradition ensured that, even after their political disappearance, Sarmatians remained part of the intellectual framework through which later historians understood Eurasian steppe history. Archaeological continuity further supports the idea of gradual cultural transformation rather than abrupt disappearance. Excavations across the Pontic-Caspian region reveal that many Sarmatian sites transition into later cultural phases without clear breaks in settlement patterns. Changes in burial practices, artifact styles, and material culture suggest adaptation to new political realities rather than complete population replacement. This evidence aligns with broader models of steppe history, in which identities were fluid and often redefined through interaction, migration, and integration. The legacy of the Sarmatians is therefore best understood as a process of diffusion rather than direct survival. Their influence extended across multiple domains, military, cultural, and social, without necessarily preserving a distinct political identity. In this sense, they represent a transitional phenomenon within Eurasian history, bridging earlier Indo-Iranian steppe cultures and the complex multi-ethnic landscapes of late antiquity and the early medieval period. By the end of antiquity, the Sarmatians no longer existed as a unified political entity, but their contributions had already been absorbed into the broader structures of Eurasian civilization. Their cavalry systems, migratory patterns, and frontier interactions with Rome had reshaped military and political dynamics across multiple regions. These effects persisted long after their disappearance as a distinct group. This concludes the full historical arc of the Sarmatians within the broader context of Eurasian history. The story of the Sarmatians does not end with conquest or disappearance, but with transformation. Across centuries of movement, conflict, and integration, they shaped the military systems, frontier politics, and cultural exchanges that defined the ancient world between steppe and empire. If you want to explore more histories like this, where entire civilizations rise, collide, and dissolve into the foundations of later worlds, subscribe to the channel and continue the journey through forgotten empires and nomadic powers. New documentaries are released regularly, each uncovering the deeper structures behind ancient civilizations and the forces that shaped them. And if there is another civilization or empire you want examined next, leave your suggestion in the comments.